Biodiversity is a fairly intuitive concept. For example, when you look at these two forests, which one has a greater biodiversity? Which one has a greater variety of forms of life? If you look, you'll see that Forest A has 4 different kinds of trees, and Forest B also has 4 different kinds of trees. So their species richness is the same. But you probably selected Forest A as being more diverse because each species is represented an equal amount, where in Forest B, one of the trees is much more common than the others, making Forest B less diverse than Forest A. Let's break this down a little bit. First, we'll talk about species richness. Joe and Amy each have a pond at their house, and each of them collect 8 frogs from their pond. You can see their collections here. Joe's on the left and Amy's on the right. Now, which one has more different kinds of frogs? It's a pretty simple question. Joe's pond has 4 kinds of frogs, Amy's has 2 kinds of frogs. And that means Joe's pond is more rich than Amy's. Richness simply means the number of different species. Getting back to our original forests, we see that the species richness in Forest A is 4. The species richness in Forest B is also 4. But it seems clear to us that Forest A has greater diversity than Forest B. Why is that? The answer is because of species evenness. Let me explain what that means. To determine species evenness, we need to count the number of individuals in each species. We want to figure out relative abundance. How common is each species? In Community 1, there are 4 species, A, B, C, and D. If we count up the number of individuals of species A, we find that it represents 25% of the total number of individuals in the community. The same is true for species B, species C, and species D. Each represents 25% of all the individuals in the community. Since all of the species are represented equally, this gives the community high evenness. In Community 2, one species is much more common than all the rest. Species A represents 80% of the individuals. Since one species is much more common than the others, this gives the community low evenness. This is a graph of the relative abundance of the species in Community 1. You can see that all of the bars are the same height. This is the maximum evenness that is possible when all species are equally abundant. In Figure 2, you can see the relative abundance of the species in Community 2. Species A represents 80% of all of the individuals in Community 2, and the other species represent much less. This community has low evenness because one species is very common and the rest of the species are uncommon. And when you look at the bars, you can see that one of the bars is much higher than the rest, so the bars are uneven, whereas the bars in Figure 1 are all even. What we see in Figure 2 is typical of all kinds of communities and species collections. Usually, 1 or 2 species are much more common than all the rest. Biodiversity can be measured on many different scales of space. Almost always when people say biodiversity, they're talking about species diversity. Just like when we're looking at Joe's pond and Amy's pond, we're counting the number of frogs in the pond. Another important measure of diversity is genetic diversity. This is the amount of diversity within a population. When you look at these wolves, you can see that each one looks a little different. This means that there's genetic diversity in the population, which can be helpful for adaptation over time. A third way of measuring biodiversity is to look at ecosystem diversity. Look at all the different kinds of ecosystems in an area. This is a map of the Missisquoi River Delta. The more kinds of land cover there are, the more possibilities there are for human use and for wildlife use. More species aren't always better. Every ecosystem has its own set of species. In this forest, a hemlock forest, it's very common to only see one species of tree. Hemlocks dominate, and this is normal. In other forests, there's a huge diversity of species. There may be 10 or 20 different species of trees, and that's normal. Every place is different. In temperate areas, it's really helpful to pay attention to forests in the fall. You can see that every tree changes at a little bit different time, and the diversity of the forest can be readily apparent. So it's great that now we know how to measure biodiversity and how to look for it at different scales, but why does it even matter? Well, it matters a lot. It matters for human well-being on many levels. It provides medicines and building supplies and food that we need. All of these things come from wild habitats. It provides services like flood control, filtering of water and air. It pollinates our crops. It builds soil and stabilizes land. Biodiversity is also really important for recreation, just things that we love to do, like go fishing and birding, photograph nature. And it's also more beautiful to have diverse ecosystems. It's important for spiritual practices, and just simply being in nature provides peace of mind. In fact, all economic activity depends on resources from the natural world. Economies depend on energy, if that's wind energy or petroleum or water, all of that comes directly from the earth. Economies require lots of water. It might be groundwater for watering crops or water for cooling factories. Many industrial materials come from the earth, minerals and metals. Our cities are literally full of natural material. Glass and concrete are around every corner. Workers need to eat. Wood needs to be turned into paper. In fact, even money is made of natural materials. Our ecosystems surround our economies. Even something as simple as the weather can have a profound effect on the way our economy functions. The question now is, what are we going to do about it? How much area are we going to allow for natural systems, and how much are we going to use up for humans? This graph is called a species area curve. It shows how many species can be found in a particular geographic area. In almost every case, all factors being equal, the more area you have, the more species you'll find. In this particular case, we're looking at breeding birds in North America. It starts out with just 3 birds at about 2/10 of a hectare and increases to 625 bird species in North America, which is about 1.9 billion hectares. This is another graph of plant species sampled in Gabon. There were 5 different sites, and as they increased the area of sampling, more species were found every time. Now, the number of species is not going to continue up forever. Eventually, it will level off. But what this tells us is that more area is better for diversity. And if we want to have diversity in our world, we need to reserve more space for ecosystems to thrive. Habitat loss is the leading cause of species extinction today, whether it be because of deforestation, climate change, or simply urban development. Therefore, some of the most important conservation efforts will include the protection of intact wild ecosystems. To summarize, biodiversity is a measurement of the variety of life. We can measure biodiversity at a number of scales of space. At the community level, we can count the number of species. This is called species diversity. At the population level, we can count the number of genes in the population. This is called genetic diversity. At the landscape level, we can count the number of ecosystems. This is called ecosystem diversity. To determine biodiversity, we need to look at both richness and evenness. Richness is simply the number of species. Evenness has to do with the relative abundance of each individual species. Are all of the species common? That's high evenness. Are some of the species common and the rest rare? That's low evenness. The most diverse communities have both high richness and high evenness. Biodiversity matters because it makes life better. It increases human well-being. In addition to ecosystem functions like building soil and harnessing energy, it also filters water, regulates climate, gives us many material goods that we need, and has many cultural benefits. It's also important to understand that all economic activity is dependent on resources from the natural world. We can't do it without nature. So even though things like energy independence, national security, education, and jobs are important issues for our time, none of it will matter without biodiversity. Biodiversity is what regulates our climate, what creates soil for our food. It provides medicines and disease protections. Without biodiversity, life will be a completely different and much less pleasant experience. If we want to keep biodiversity, we need to protect habitats. Habitat loss is the biggest threat to biodiversity today. If we protect habitat, wildlife has a much better chance of surviving the many threats they face today, including invasive species, overharvesting, poaching, climate change, small population sizes, and disease. The best thing we can do is to create more habitat and protect what we already have.